Module 4 talks about Chinese mestizos in the Philippines. This module will take you to Chinese history of Jose Rizal and his ancestry. Rizal had a long line of Chinese influence from his great-great-grandparents who were tied to mainland China. Back then, Chinese people traded goods brought from China and distributed to northern Luzon and many other areas via sea route. As a consequence of their long presence in the country, they mingled with local people, and the result was intermarriage between Chinese and locals, which bore children to be called Chinese mestizos or mestizas, while Spanish men who married Filipino women bore Spanish mestizos or mestizas. Such intermarriage also signaled intercultural exchange with nuances of Chinese and Spanish culture mixed with local counterpart. If you notice, the previous module talked about Creole nationalism, wherein original Spanish settlers moved out of their country and settled in the Americas, and out of which they mingled with local people, forcing them to become part of the localized national imaginings. Okay, this is the same analysis with the Chinese mestizos that were mixed with the local Filipinos, forming local nationalism. In the abstraction, only a few Filipino people are aware that Jose Rizal's great great grandfather was a pure Chinese from the Fujian province of mainland China. In the Rizal family tree found at the Bahay Chinoy, at least four of Jose Rizal's ancestors are described as having Chinese blood in them. His maternal great grandmother, Regina Ochoa, is described as a Spanish Chinese mestiza. His father's side of the family tree is dotted with many people described as either Chinese or mestizo Chinese. His most illustrious Chinese ancestor, Doming Lamco, was born in China in 1662 and whose original Chinese name was Kui Yilam. The Lolo of Jose Rizal had an even more distinguished ancestry in China. Kua clan. Domingo Lamco belonged to the Kua clan of South China. The surname Kua is considered today as the 44th most common name in China. It is a variant of the family name Kai, which also has variant translations that include Tsai, Choi, Chua, Q, and Chai. The Kuwas are considered today as the most prosperous families in South China and in other parts of Asia. The Kuwas are very ancient line which can be traced how many generations ago to the times when unified China was still non-existent. They are the descendants of the Shu Du, the fifth son of Shu Wu Wang, the political genius who started the Chu dynasty. Shu Du was later made the Duke of Kai and was known as Kai Shu. He was an active member of the royal court and was one of the three guards during the first years of the Chu dynasty. It was 600 years later when the descendants finally formalized the usage of the surname Kai. As already stated, the Kuwas today continue to enjoy the same status that did hundreds of years ago. Taiwanese billionaire Tsai Wan-lin of the Cathay Life Group and Chua To-hing of Gudang Garam Group of Indonesia are two of the richest Kua descendants today, according to Forbes magazine. Domingo Lamco, Rizal's great-great-grandfather, was the 19th generation descendant of the Chai Shu Du. At the age of 35, Lamco was baptized in June 1697 in the Parian Church of San Gabriel. He took the name Domingo since he was baptized on Sunday. Lamco then became Domingo Lamco. Okay, the next subtitle is Settled in Laguna. In his baptismal record, his parents were simply listed as Sionco and Junio. He settled in Binyan, Laguna on the Dominican estate called San Isidro, Labrador. Domingo married Ines de la Rosa, a girl very much younger than he was. She was the daughter of his friend Agustin Cinco, a rich Chinese merchant, and Jacinta Rafaela, a Chinese mestizo of Parlan. Doming's son was Francisco, the first in the line to use mercado as a surname. The name mercado, a Spanish word for market, aptly described the livelihood of Domingo's family as they were entrepreneurs. Later, Francisco's grandson and namesake, Rizal's father, changed the family name to Rizal to suit his farming business, since Rizal is derived from the Spanish racial, which means green fields. Despite the persecution that the Chinese and the Chinese mestizos suffered from the Spaniards, the ancestors of Rizal were fearless people who ensured the survival of their family and their livelihood. From this strength of character, no doubt, Rizal got his ability to remain calm and composed even in the face of adversities or adversaries. Some of Rizal's works and writings are said to be biased against and contemptuous of the Chinese. A Rizaliano article convincingly proved that he was indeed anti-Chinese. But the article also rationalized his antagonism towards the Chinese was largely a product of the cultural and political situation of his time. Perhaps today's anti-Chinese sentiment can be attributed to a cultural difference with his new wave of overseas Chinese, a political and military issue which China, and mainly an economic issue with a country that wants to dominate our region economically through bullying, aggression, intimidation, and unscrupulous business practices. An article entitled Rizal's Chinese Overcoat, written by Alfonso Ang, a Chinese-Filipino writer and member of the Philippine National Historical Society, partly describes Rizal's Chinese ancestry and lineage. Ironically, despite this fact about his ancestry, the article lengthily proves his being anti-Chinese. It cites many instances of Rizal's contempt for the Chinese, and his anti-Chinese behavior throughout his works and historical records. Proofs of Rizal's anti-Chinese behavior was drawn and concluded from these instances. His description and portrayal of a Chinese character by the name of Quiroga in his novel El Filibusterismo, his dislike of Chinese merchants, and his boycotting of Chinese stores during his exile in Dapitan, his denial of his Chinese ancestry during his trial in Fort Santiago, his expressed anti-Chinese sentiments in some of his letters, and other instances where he showed his contempt for the Chinese. The article also noted that Rizal never mentioned his Chinese lineage in any of his writings. The next subtitle is from an article entitled The Chinese Mestizo in the Philippines. This section will discuss the Chinese mestizo in the Philippines, a critical reading material for your perusal or reading. Historically, the Chinese mestizo played an important role in the Philippines, but there was no mention in writings of such influence. You will find out that one of the reasons was that the mere definition of mestizo was confusing, as there was a Spanish mestizo and Chinese mestizo. Such differentiation favored Spanish mestizo as a Spanish-Filipino mixed, while the Chinese mestizo just faded in obscurity. During the time when Chinese mestizos grew in numbers, they became merchants and traders who would exchange goods brought from China to be distributed to northern Luzon and other parts of the country, including Manila. As businessmen, they were required to pay taxes higher than those of the Indios, while lower than Chinese citizens. Between the Chinese and Indio, the former was a supplier of goods and taxpayers, while on the extreme opposite was the Indio, that never supplied goods and nor paid any tax except to offer labor service. Somewhere in between was the Chinese mestizo that was economically capable of fulfilling duties such as paying taxes and selling goods to the community. Throughout most of the time, this Segregation in status was a dictum of Spanish way of governing, divide and conquer. Indeed, apart from the convenience of taxation, social compartmentalization was a way of defining distinctions, functions, roles, and duties of each class, and at the same time, it was easy to monitor movements. Geographically, Chinese mestizos were allowed to move in different islands just like the Indios, while Chinese people were restricted in terms of rights. It was rather twofold. Mestizos enjoyed the same rights with the Indios, but the Chinese did not. In the article, you will come to know that Wickberg, the author of this article, reported that the Chinese mestizo rose to prominence between 1741 and 1898 primarily as a landholder, middleman, wholesaler of local produce and foreign imports, although there were also mestizos in the professions. The rise of the mestizos was indicative of social change that was not vividly noticed much later. It would also be noticed that changes in renewal of Chinese immigration impacted on their professions, thereby changing to different careers apart from being tradesmen, which basically described them. Due to their active involvement in commerce and trade, their influence paved the way for the development of a robust middle class that sprang based on economic dynamism of Chinese ancestry that influenced them mainly. As such, the middle class composed by the Chinese mestizos rose up the ladder, acquired positions in various colonial offices set by the government. Next, they were culturally rich in terms of ostentatious display of artifacts in their devotion to Catholics, described as even more Catholic than Spanish and Filipino citizens. Finally, Rizal was a Chinese mestizo with a long line of Chinese ancestry. As such, it would only be fitting to know that his origins would be critical in the formation of a Filipino nationality. In another article, Chu 2016 noted that the term mestizo or tisoy today is often used to refer to someone of Eurasian ancestry. During the Spanish colonial government, especially during the 18th and 19th centuries, the term usually referred to offspring of intermarriages between Chinese men and local women. The rise of the Chinese mestizo came about as unions between Chinese and local women, encouraged by Spanish colonial policy, grew in number. So did the number of Chinese mestizo children. With the increase of Chinese mestizos, especially in the urban areas, the Spanish colonial government began to establish a separate legal classification for them. Cities such as Manila and Cebu thus became communities of Indios, Sanglis, and Chinese mestizos. Initially, the division was mainly drawn for the purpose of taxation, following its policy of taxing their subjects according to their capacity to earn. The Spanish colonial government taxed the Chinese the most, followed by the Chinese mestizos and then the Indios, according to Chu in 2016. Some additional notes: in 1594, Spanish Governor General Luis Perez Dasmariñas made Binondo as permanent settlement for Chinese mestizos who became Catholic converts. Aside from the place's bustling economic activities such as trading goods, considered free within the area, intermarriages between locals and Chinese immigrants took place as well. As a result, Chinese mestizos spread to other areas like Santa Cruz, Tondo, and in other provinces as well, notably Iloilo, Pampanga, and Cebu. In the northern areas, they are also populated in Pangasinan, Benguet, and Mountain Province. During that time, a Chinese mestizo was any person born of a Chinese father and Indio mother, a Spanish mestiza and Chinese mestizo, a child of Spanish mestiza and Chinese mestizo, but a Chinese mestiza and an Indio were classified